Hey, what's up going on YouTube? I am Jimmy Sequence. I am actually making this video to go over a subject that I've had discussions about on the channel. I made a video on this topic before, and I feel like another video is warranted because I have maybe one person on the channel that insists that they need to school me on ohmage, whether or not 2 ohms is good, and the ramifications of using 2 ohms. Let me start by saying I've been in the sound system business since I was literally a kid, right? The first system we started was maybe 12 years old, right? So I am fully aware of the different ohms and what they represent. So we're going to discuss, I'm going to discuss the 2 ohms, 4 ohms, 8 ohm loads. What is better? What is more practical? What makes more sense? Seeing? Alright, let's say I've used all kinds of amplifiers. I've used from the Macintosh to the QSC to the Carver to the Crown to, Crest, you name it. I've used practically all of the amplifiers. Most of the older amplifiers were not stable at 2 ohms. So that is where the argument is coming from. Most of those amplifiers did not play enough power to be stable at 2 ohms. In other words, the Macintosh, I used the Macintosh 2500 when those things were $4,000 per amplifier in the 80s. Seeing? The Macintosh 2500 played 1000 watt per channel. It was a very stable amp at 2 ohms, but it wouldn't make sense to put 4 speakers on one side of a 1000 watt amplifier. So that didn't make sense. So amplifier like that, you play 2 speakers on each side, you play 4 ohms. See? And you buy 400 watt speakers. Because the Macintosh was really a 1000 watt amp, 1000 watts per channel. But if you're playing 2 speakers, that's 400 watts per channel, 400 watts peak power, RMS power, then you can use the Macintosh to play 4 speaker, which is what we did back in the 80s. Same? Fast forward to say the QSE 3000s. Those played 3200 watts per channel. Same? At 4 ohms. So we played that amp at 4 ohms. We played 2 800 watt speakers. those speakers were 800 watts peak power. So RMS powers on those speakers were more like 600 watts. So if you're using an amplifier that plays 3200 watts per channel, you can put 2 speakers on it and still be pretty good. So when we were using the 3000, we were using 800 watt peak powers. So RMS power was about 6. So that's what we did with the QSE 3000. We had a bunch of those, so we had it was pretty good. It was pretty solid actually. Now, as you get into the modern amp, things change. But let's continue down that road. The best, most stable, cleanest way to play an amplifier would be to play in 8 ohms, right? Since people are gonna argue with me about this. 8 ohms would make the cleanest sound system. But how practical is that? If you're building a home system, a home stereo system, and you only have 2 18s or 2 subs, 8 ohms makes sense because you have one per side. If you have an amplifier that plays 2000 watt and you're using some speakers that plays 600 watts RMS, you can put one on each side and sound extremely clear. You feel me? If you're using a home stereo system, 8 ohms makes sense. Home theater, home stereo, 8 ohms makes sense because you really don't need that many speakers in your house. So you can use 2 subs, 1 amplifier to play your 2 subs. If you're using mid-range, you use 1 amplifier to play your mid-range. 1 on each side. That's perfectly clear. But think about making a humongous professional sound system at 8 ohms. I mean, if money is no object, then you can do that because you can have you know, a 20 amps audio amplifiers on your sound system. Because if you're using 8 bass boxes, then each amplifier will only be able to play two speakers if you're playing 8 ohm, one per side. So just do the math. If you're trying to play a whole bunch of speakers, 8 double 18s or whatever, then you really 8 ohms makes no sense on a professional system. And again, unless money is no object. So basically most sound systems go for 4 ohms, which is what I did throughout the time as a sound system owner. Every amplifier that I've played up until now was 4 ohms because it makes sense. It's more practical, it's more affordable, and the amplifiers are all generally pretty stable at 4 ohms. So 8 ohms and 4 ohms, most amplifiers are really, really stable at those ohmage. So every amplifier that I use up until now was 4 ohms. See? And it makes sense. And again, most sound system would be playing at 4 ohms. I always argue against 2 ohms. And there are a couple of reasons why I argued against 2 ohms. See? Well, it wouldn't make sense, I should say, to use 8 ohms. And one of the other reasons is because, again, you would need so many amplifiers. But the one of the benefits of using 8 ohms, if you can afford to do that, would be if one of your amplifiers would fail, you would really only lose 2 speakers. So this is the pros of using 8 ohms if you can afford to have several racks full of amplifiers to play your speakers. If you're using 8 ohms and one amplifier goes, you lose 2 speakers. So to every amplifier that breaks, you're only losing 2 speakers. So I don't have to explain the pros of having multiple amplifiers. I mean, some professional pro audio systems, like in the arena settings, back in the days had racks of amplifiers. And the reason they had so many racks of amplifiers is because, again, for that reason. If they lose an amplifier, they only losing 2 speakers. Now, conversely, if you're using 2 ohms and you lose an amplifier, you're losing 8 speakers. So that's the con of using 2 ohms. You put in a lot of speakers on one amplifier. So if you lose that amplifier, you're losing 8 speakers. So is it the most practical way to do it? Probably not. But then again, the amplifiers back in the days were not stable at 2 ohms. See? Most of them were not stable at 2 ohms. Fast forward to now, the modern amplifiers are designed to be very stable at 2 ohms. So you can play 8 speakers on an amplifier with no issue. 4 per side. The modern amplifiers, I'm talking the modern amplifiers, the PowerSofts, the CVRs, the Admark, those amplifiers are playing extremely stable at 2 ohms. You can play them at 2 ohms comfortably without getting into any problems. You don't have to overdrive the amplifiers because the amplifiers are playing a lot of power. So you can play them, you can trackle them actually. Because when I'm playing the CVR 4302, I am playing it with just green lights. There's no red lights, there's no orange lights, you're trackling the amplifiers because the amplifiers playing so much power that you don't have to overdrive them. So 2 ohms is extremely stable, right? So the same argument, the argument that, we would use back in the days, because I would be one of the people arguing against 2 ohms. And again, I argued against 2 ohms primarily because I'm thinking if your amplifier breaks, you're losing 8 speakers. That was my argument all the time. I have more than one of these amplifiers. So, you know what I'm saying? If I'm playing, say, 4W18 and the amplifier craps out for whatever reason, I have more amplifiers. So I'll put the other amplifier on and continue playing. So ideally, again, if money is no object, 8 ohms. The more practical would be 4 ohms. But the new modern powerful, extremely powerful amplifiers, like again the CVR is playing 12,400 watts per channel at 2 ohms, which means you can play 8 speakers on it comfortably without any kind of problems. You get me? So yeah, to the person that keeps going back and forth with me about which amplifier it's not good for the amplifier and this and that, I am aware that 2 ohms is not necessarily ideal, but you must understand that the new modern amplifiers are actually quite stable at 2 ohms. So you can play 2 ohms on the modern amplifiers that's designed to play stable at 2 ohms. A lot of the older amplifiers weren't stable at 2 ohms. So that's basically where the argument is coming from. The old amplifiers were not stable at 2 ohms. Some of them didn't even play 2 ohms. Because a lot of the QSCs weren't recommended at 2 ohms. And they would say that in the manual. I bought these amplifiers brand new, so I know. A lot of the QSC amplifiers were not able to play at 2 ohms. They would say that. And a lot of the older amplifiers, if you have the manuals and you read the manuals, they don't recommend 2 ohms because the amplifiers were not stable at 2 ohms. You get me? But you cannot compare those amplifiers to the modern amplifiers that is actually designed to play stable at 2 ohms. I'll give you another example. Initially, I didn't understand drive racks, so I stuck to crossovers. You get me? I didn't understand anything about drive racks, so I didn't mess with drive racks until I learned it and was able to handle my sound system properly without having to have someone come in to do it for me. Because I believe in doing it yourself if you can. Learn the system, learn about the amplifiers, learn about pro audio. If you're gonna be a sound system owner, I feel like it's imperative that you understand something about it. See? So I didn't want to use drive racks where every time my sound is playing I have to ask somebody to come and do it for me. So I learned it before I put one on my sound system. I'm saying that to say there's nothing wrong with crossovers. Crossovers are still great. It's just drive racks are more practical. You're using one piece of equipment to do what you would need 4 or 5 pieces of equipment to do. So it makes more sense. It's more practical. It's modern. It's what's going on. It's up to date. You feel me? So, I mean, there's still people arguing against drive rack primarily because they don't understand it. But, you know, I was there once. I'm not there no more because I learned how to use it. So now I am all for drive rack because I understand it. Same thing here. There was a time where I would personally argue against playing a 2 ohms because, again, my reason was if you lose an amplifier, you lose an 8 speaker. That still stands, except nowadays the amplifiers are more stable and you can actually depend on them. I've played multiple times at very high volumes all night. There's thousands of sound systems all over the world playing CVRs at very high volumes all night at 2 ohms, and there's no issue. I'm not saying there will never be any issue, but so far I have no issues. And the amplifier is actually quite stable. And I know people that's using the PowerSoft and the AdMark at 2 ohms, and they're having no problems. Again, these new amplifiers are designed to play at 2 ohms. See? Very stable at 2 ohms. So you cannot compare them to the old amplifiers. There are nuances. They're you know, you have to figure out what speaker you're using. What's the peak power on the speakers? What's the RMS power on the speakers? And you have to make sure the amplifier is playing at least 1.5 times the RMS power that the speaker requires. That was always the problem. If you're using, you know, amplifier that plays 2,000 watts, you can't load 8 speakers on it. You just cannot. You get me? If you're playing 2,000 watts per channel, put in 8 speakers, 4 speakers per side is just not a practical thing. It doesn't make sense. Now, if the amplifier is playing 12,000 something watts per channel, you can. So that is the difference. I mean, and again, people are going to argue for until thy kingdom come that it's not stable to use 2 ohms and this and that. But these amplifiers are designed to play very stable at 2 ohms. That is my argument. Now, I know people are going to chime in, and I want people to chime in. But just know that there are differences between the new amplifiers and the old amplifiers. What worked in the 80s and 90s and the old heavyweight transformer amplifiers are not necessarily the same with these new digital amplifiers. These new digital one rack space amplifiers are designed to be stable. It is what it is. The new amplifiers are stable at 2 ohms. Believe it or not. Alright, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys on the next video.
Broken-hearted sound boy, toiling in the dancehall. A disappointed sound boy who has no double plates at all.